lately we've had a lot of information come in, and we've done a lot of talking about what our public schools are doing in response to COVID-19 heading into this new school year. There's a lot of hot debate across the state of Michigan, a number of very fiery school board meetings, a lot of finger pointing, a lot of anger on both sides of the argument, pointing to the other side. But these issues of COVID-19 and keeping our students, our educational staff, our faculty safe doesn't just affect our public schools. It also affects our private schools, our religious schools, and other non-public education institutions. And to join us to talk about those issues and how COVID-19 is affecting those institutions, we're pleased to be joined once again by Brian Broderick. He is the Executive Director of the Michigan Association of Non-Public Schools, joining us on the MegaCast, including on your radio homes 89.3 WBLD Orchard Lake and 88.1 WBFH Bloomfield Hills. Brian, thanks for being with us today.
Hi, Tyler. Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate having you on. So, just to start off, for those that are unfamiliar, do non-public schools, do they fall under the same requirements, restrictions, regulations as public schools do under the state of Michigan guidance, federal guidance, and so on?
Yeah, with regard to the public health guidance that's come out and the public health mandates that have come out over the past year from the state of Michigan and now local county health departments, yes, they all apply to private schools as well as public schools.
So how has that affected plans or execution of plans going into this school year? Because some institutions on a public level had mask mandates in place or vaccination requirements for staff in place. Others were kind of a mixed bag of either having all of those things be optional or some of them be, such as mask wearing, be required. What was mostly the case for our non-public schools, and how did some of these local health orders change the game for that as they prepared to start the school year?
Yeah, for our members, which are the Catholic schools in the state of Michigan, the schools in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and then Christian Schools International, we pretty much mirrored in terms of the public schools what they were doing with regard to responding to COVID. So some schools were planning on having or requiring masks. Some schools were requiring masks just for the younger grades. Other schools were not requiring masks at all. I don't believe we had any vaccination requirements or mandates for staff at all. I think every staff at a non-public school is encouraged to get vaccinated, but I don't think anybody mandated that it had to occur. And so that was sort of the drive in terms of how things were going to go at the beginning of the school year. Then across the state, we've seen a number of local county health departments actually issue orders mandating masks. Some have been K through 12, others have been K through 6. So those students who cannot get vaccinated yet, usually ages 12 and under, requiring mask mandates. So that's caused our schools to have to sort of change course to tell them whether our local county health or mask mandates in place, that the school will abide by those health orders as they're required to by law. And then we had a number of schools where there are no local county health orders still require students, particularly in the under 12-year-old students, to wear masks as well. So it's kind of across the board. It kind of mirrors what's going on, I think, on the public school side. And I think the angst and reaction to it amongst our parent community also mirrors the same that you're hearing with regard to public school and public school board meetings. There are, a set of parents who want their children to wear masks, and there are a set of parents who don't want their children to wear masks and don't appreciate being told that they have to by a local unit of government.
We're joined by Brian Broderick. He's the Executive Director of the Michigan Association of Non-Public Schools, or MANS, with us on the MegaCast today. And on that note, with the differences that are still at play between those that are in favor of mask mandates and those that are against it, we've seen a lot of really chippy debate at school board meetings on the public side of the coin over the last several weeks, several months leading up to this school year. Across the board, you've mentioned that there's been some pushback from parents that are against mask mandates and mask policies. Across the board, generally speaking, what has been the verdict of our non-public schools here in the state of Michigan? Are they mostly going with mask mandates? Of course, depending on their public health orders, but
Right.
regardless
Yeah.
of those public health orders, are they have they mostly been in favor of those mask mandate precautions, or has it been more of if they can pick and choose, they go with a more optional route?
Yeah, I think the schools that are in counties that have a mask order, at least in our membership, are complying with the mask order. Nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to have their students in masks, but nobody wants to go to on a remote learning or a hybrid learning either. And so it's the sacrifice that schools have decided to make in order to make in-person learning viable this year. And so they're going to do it with the mask. Now, there are schools, I know there are schools that are out there that are not complying with the mask mandate. I know there are private schools that are out there that are not complying with the mask mandate, and it's caused a rift because there are students in private schools who have the mask mandate and are implementing it and requiring it, and then there's a school down the street that could be a private school that isn't doing it and is just ignoring it completely. And so parents are pulling their kids out of one school and sending them to the school without masks. And that's a problem, and that's going to come down to whether local county health departments are going to actually enforce their orders. I know there's one in Oakland County, for instance, where this is going on.
We're joined by Brian Broderick, Executive Director of the Michigan Association of Non-Public Schools, with us today on the MegaCast, talking about the mask issue, the vaccination issue, the hot debate among all of our schools, because it doesn't just apply to our public schools in this situation. It's also been a hot debate in our non-public schools, which affects a lot of students and a lot of staff as well. Let's talk about the staff, though. In some school institutions, they are requiring, particularly at the college level, we've seen this more than we have at the K through 12 level of any kind, that these institutions have required in many cases for their staff and their faculty and even their students to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19. What is the status across the board with our non-public schools in terms of, particularly for the staff, having been required to get COVID-19 vaccines?
I'm not aware of anybody requiring it. I think it's strongly recommended that staff get vaccinated, but I don't know anybody who requires it. I think the colleges generally are doing it, the ones where there's residential living, and so they have students that are living in dorms or apartment buildings and such, and then you have teachers that are coming in and professors that are teaching them, and so they're trying to mitigate the spread. It's a little bit of different sort of setting in K-12 where students go back to their homes and there's not that sort of congregate living. But yeah, I'm not aware of any school, public or private school, that has actually mandated that their staff get vaccinated, but I think it's strongly encouraged.
In terms of other precautions that are being taken beyond mandates, beyond the mask mandate, beyond the vaccination requirements or vaccination recommendations, there's a great article today from Bridge Michigan Magazine that kind of analyzed with some data various precautions that can be taken against COVID-19 or are being taken against COVID-19 spread in schools. It particularly focused on public schools, but these different scenarios and these measures apply to all school institutions. What additional measures beyond, of course, requiring masks, social distancing, have our public schools put into place as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic to aid the prevention of the spread of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things going on in the schools, and they're really a carryover from last year, but there's a real big emphasis on hand washing. There's a big emphasis on keeping kids apart as much as possible in terms of distancing. There's a real big emphasis, and it'll work well for the next couple months, is to have as much classroom time outside as you can, because that relieves the mask requirement. So if you can move the children outside and teach outside, and with proper equipment and technology, I think that becomes more and more possible. That helps as well. So that's a big emphasis. Obviously, you can only do that for a few months here because of the great weather that we have in the state of Michigan. And by the time you roll around to November or December, outdoor education becomes a little bit more difficult. But those are the kind of things that are occurring. And then every year, schools emphasize to parents, keep your kid home if if they exhibit any symptoms, and this is pre-COVID, anytime you have a fever or not feeling well, you shouldn't send your student to school. And that's really being emphasized this year because of the rapid spread of COVID, that if you're sick, you got to stay home so that those germs don't spread.
In terms of online learning and virtual learning capabilities, we've seen some school districts that while they're focusing on returning most of their kids to in-person learning, they're still providing some of those virtual means in this school year, because some families and some kids have found that it's more effective for them in their learning process. Are we seeing that in any or in many of our non-public school institutions as well?
Yeah, I don't know if it's very widespread. I mean, there might be some isolated instances where an online or remote option is available, but the real emphasis is to get the kids back into a classroom and do the in-person learning. That seemed to be the most effective for most of the students. If something went south in terms of numbers at a particular school, I think our schools are now better positioned to flip a class to a remote learning setting or a hybrid setting than they were pre-COVID, because now they know how it works. They have the equipment, they have the technology and the access points to be able to do it. But the real emphasis is to do the in-person learning. And if there is some sort of a circumstance that comes up where somebody has to do remote learning, I think that they can pivot to do it, but it's not something that they're anxious about doing or really want to do in a widespread basis.
We're joined by Brian Broderick. He is the Executive Director of the Michigan Association of Non-Public Schools with us today on the MegaCast. Brian, just a few more minutes with you. Are there any other issues that are currently affecting our non-public schools, similarly to our public schools or different from our public schools, that are of note and should be something that people are at least aware of in our communities as we go back into school for yet another year affected by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Right. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything really remarkably different, with regard to the impact of COVID, whether it's a public school or a private school. I think, schools are really just asking families, parents, and children to be resilient. And I think they've been resilient over the last year and a half. The private schools in the state, particularly our membership, really made an emphasis last year that we're going to do in-person learning. And so the schools were open pretty much all last year, except for where there were problems with when a COVID outbreak occurred. They would have to shut down for a period of time or shut down some classrooms. But overall, the emphasis was, we can do this with the proper precautions. And I think we're trying to do it again this year as well with all the proper precautions. So the real message is for parents and students to remain patient and keep up that resiliency, so that we're able to educate children. That's what we're in the business for, is to educate children, and that should be the ultimate goal of any school. And if there are requirements that come along the way that serve the public health, and no matter how distasteful they might be, I think that our schools need to be able to adapt to those requirements and do the best they can in good faith and follow the requirements that are placed upon them by governmental agencies and deliver education to children.
We're joined by Brian Broderick. He's the Executive Director of the Michigan Association of Non-Public Schools with us today on the MegaCast. And Brian, before we let you go in just a couple of minutes, I just want to ask to get some more information for our audience as they're watching this and as they're learning and as they look into your organization. How does the Michigan Association of Non-Public Schools factor into aiding the decision process on many of these different COVID-related issues and other educational-related issues for these school institutions, and how does it factor in terms of advocacy for these schools, as well as these different counties and different health divisions are also making these decisions that not only affect our public schools and our other institutions, but also our non-public schools as well?
Yeah, we work really closely and advocate on behalf of our schools with state government and with the Michigan Department of Education. Probably less so. We haven't had a lot of communication with the Department of Health, because those issues haven't come up except for at times like this when we're still under the pandemic. We really kind of serve as a resource for our schools. So when we get information, we make sure that we get it out as soon as possible. We do a weekly updates to schools. And so when things come out from the Michigan Department of Health or any state agency, we're able to communicate that. The local health agencies, because there's so many of them, there's 83 counties in Michigan. So I guess there's 83 local health agencies as well. We don't necessarily control or have the access to that, but they work closely with the schools. We give advice to the schools and advocate for the schools on their behalf. But our basic role in the state, role with the schools is to say, you need to comply with local health mandates. It's clear in the law that there's not an out because you're necessarily a private school. And so we do that sort of work. We're doing a lot of work right now with the Michigan Department of Ed with regard to COVID relief funding that's come down from the federal government. And so that's something that all of our schools are interested as well. There's a economic assistance to non-public school funds that are available for non-public schools to access via application. They're grant monies that can help them with issues of learning loss, education, technology, social and emotional learning. So right now we're navigating that system with the state and serving as an advocate for our schools with regard to that process.
Brian, we appreciate you joining us today. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, thank you, Tyler. Appreciate it.